We might get started. Julia, do I need to do anything to tell them to start the live stream? Should be good. Thank you. Lovely. Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for coming this evening. My name is Monique Ryan. I am the federal member for Kooyong, and one of the really lovely things about being the local member is the ability to host town hall meetings about things that we care about. Firstly, let me acknowledge that we are on the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and that this land was never ceded to us, and that we pay our respects to the Wurundjeri elders past, present and emerging, and to any Indigenous people who might be with us tonight. We've got a pretty significant, serious conversation to have this evening, and I think that in the lead up to the next federal election, it's a good time to be having this. I was just saying to the two guest speakers from this evening that in the last 3 years, the first 3 years in which I've been in the federal parliament, we haven't had a single conversation in the House about defence or about the national security threat, which is implicit in our acknowledgement of the real and ongoing and increasing threat of climate change. It is time as a country that we talk about it. It's, I think, in some ways a difficult conversation, and we'll touch on that this evening. But I can't think of any people more qualified to speak to the issue of national security and climate change than our two guests this evening. I'll just introduce Chris and David. David's then going to speak about climate security and give us a little bit of a presentation on that. Then we'll have a conversation between David, Chris and myself, and then we have ample time, I think, for questions from the audience. So I'm hoping this will be quite an interactive session, and we're expecting to be done at about 8:30. If anyone needs them, the bathrooms are out the back. Please feel free to go in and out as you need. But I think it'll be good to get started. So our first speaker this evening is David Spratt, and David is a prominent Australian climate policy analyst and advocate. He is the research director at the Breakthrough National Centre for Climate Restoration, which is an Australian-based think tank dedicated to advancing climate science and policy solutions. He wrote a really groundbreaking book called Climate Code Red, The Case for Emergency Action, back in 2008, and has also co-authored What Lies Beneath the Understatement of Existential Climate Risk in 2018. He's a prolific writer. I've written a number of his reports. I can't say that they're easy reading, but they're compelling reading. And he's an expert essentially on climate threats, risk assessment, and the need for transformative action on those things. And I think his work really is globally influential, and we're incredibly lucky to have David with us this evening. Other guest speaker is Admiral Chris Barrie, who I think probably to many of you requires no introduction. But Chris served with great distinction in the Navy for over 4 decades, culminating in his role from 1998 to 2002 as Chief of the Defence Force. During his illustrious career, he was Vice Chief of the Defence Force. He was also Deputy Chief of Naval Staff for some time, and his leadership and service have been recognised, with him being made a Companion of the Order of Australia. Since he's retired from active service in the military, he really has dedicated himself to addressing the intersectionality of climate change and national security. He's an honorary professor at the Strategic and Defence Studies Centre at ANU, a co-founding and executive member of the Australian Security Leaders Climate Group, which I can tell you has been an extraordinarily generous source of support, information to the community-focused, climate-focused independents in this term of Parliament. Has been an ongoing and vocal advocate for recognising climate change as a fundamental threat to our national and global security. it's a great pleasure to welcome you here this evening. So we'll start with David. We'll hear about the scope of the problem. We'll have a bit of a scene setting, and then we'll move on to the Q&A session. Thank you.
Hello everybody, thanks Monique. This is historic. To my knowledge, this is the first time that any MP of the Federal Parliament, indeed of any Parliament in Australia, has had a public meeting, a town hall on climate security. So it's a fantastic thing. And I hope others will be inspired to do the same thing. As Monique said, climate conversations can be difficult because we are in a period of political procrastination, and we're in a period where governments, including our own, are acting as appeasers of big oil and gas. And the harsh reality is that on the present trajectory, we are heading towards a very difficult place in terms of what climate change will do to our country and around the world. Europe's most distinguished climate thinker, a guy called Professor Hans-Joachim Schellenhuber, who advised Angela Merkel, the EU, the German government and many others, put it this way, and I'll quote, he said, "On the present path, there is a very big risk that we will just end our civilization. The human species will survive somehow, but we will destroy almost everything we have built up over the last 2,000 years." And that, honestly, is what a lot of scientists are saying. So people often say to me in these things, don't we need hope rather than fear? You know, we want to be hopeful. And my response is always the same, and I'll share it with you again tonight, and it's a bit in Monique's area. If you look at the studies of public health promotion, whether it's smoking or AIDS or pandemics or any of those sorts of things, there are two characteristics that make those programs, that public education work. The first is being really honest about the problem. I mean, whether it's the Grim Reaper or the things on the cereal packets, be really honest about the problem, because you've got to engage people on the problems that really exist. And the second thing is to give people an efficacious course of action, what you can do. I mean, I remember those smoking ads that said, every time you ring the quit line, you're this much closer to getting there. I mean, so the course of action, and I think it's the same about climate. Be brutally honest about the problem and find a path forward. So as you know, scientists have been shocked over the last couple of years in what's happened to the climate system. 2023 was 1.5, much quicker than expected. Last year was 1.6, and January, the month just passed, was 1.75. This was a shock, and the rate is accelerating. Climate heating and the extremes, I mean, we look in Australia, we look in Europe, we look what's happened in California, are happening quicker than expected. Even our bushfires over the last decade have been of an intensity that the projection said would not happen till the end of this century. I mean, people were shocked by the Black Summer. So over and over again, things are getting worse more quickly than expected. So somebody like Sarah Perkins Kirkpatrick, who's now at the ANU, a climate scientist, says, and I quote, "We are hitting record-breaking extremes much sooner than I expected." So we've witnessed the incredible LA fires. You might remember before that Hurricane Helene in the United States. Each of those caused damage of $250 billion. $250 billion Australian dollars. I mean, our economy is about $2 trillion a year. So those two events are the same of a quarter of everything Australia produces in a year, just to give you an idea of the magnitude. We saw that record-breaking rain in Europe. I mean, I won't say my favourite photo from what happened in Valencia, but the most striking photo of those floods in Spain, the record-breaking rain in Central and Eastern Europe, the floods in Brazil and Kenya, the fact that during the Hajj in Saudi Arabia this year, 1,300 people died because it was simply too hot, and so on. So the climate system is undergoing fundamental change, and large elements of that system, including the ice at our poles, are reaching or have passed their tipping points. That is, they're moving to a point where they're going to quite quickly move to a different state. So let me give you a couple of examples. Here are some of the tipping points. These four on your screen, Greenland, the Arctic sea ice, the coral reefs and West Antarctica, have already passed their tipping point. What that means is no further levels of CO2 are required for them to move to a completely different state. There are three others which store large amounts of our carbon in the permafrost, in the boreal forests of northern Canada, in the Amazon. Great stores of carbon, drawing down carbon every year, which are now, it would seem, starting to release carbon instead. In the case of the Amazon, because it's drying and there are fires and more carbon is going out than is being drawn down. And the biggest one of all, if you follow it at all, has been a thing called, I'll call it the Atlantic circulation, technically the Atlantic Meridional or overturning circulation. It's that great circulation that carries warm water from the Caribbean up the north coast of the United States and into northwestern Europe, making that part of Europe several degrees warmer than it would otherwise be. And there is now increasing evidence, particularly in the last 6 months, of new papers and research coming out. It's already slowed 15%, saying this could stop, this circulation could stop by the middle of this century. This is peer-reviewed science, and honestly, if you talk to scientists, this is the thing that really worries them the most. It is the we can't believe this is happening sort of moment. What would that current slowing mean? It would mean, according in one scientist, that agriculture in the UK, Ireland and northwestern Europe would become non-viable. Non-viable. The West African and South Asian monsoons would become unreliable. There would be a 1 metre sea level rise on both sides of the Atlantic, and the wet and dry seasons in the Amazon would switch. I mean, this is like a really big thing. And those things interact. So let me just give you one example how what scientists call cascading, where one impact leads to another. So we know that the Arctic is warming really quickly, 4 times the global average. The sea ice is melting up there. Greenland is melting. Greenland is pouring more cold water into the top of the Atlantic. That's what's slowing down the Atlantic circulation. The more Greenland melts, and this is the driver of that circulation stopping, it is the melting of Greenland. When that circulation slows, as I said, you can get a metre sea level rise on the eastern US, including in Virginia, where the US military is raising the docks of the largest naval base in the world because they're going to be underwater. It also means the West African monsoon becomes less reliable. It also means that the eastern Amazon gets less rain and dries out, more fires, more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, more warming, and so you get that sort of that circle of events. So we have also seen, for my sins, read Bloomberg Green very regularly. In the last couple of months, every second story in Bloomberg Green has been about big oil and gas and banks backsliding on their climate commitments. All the commitments they made at Paris in 2015 for net zero 2050, they're now saying, oh no, we didn't really mean that. Too much money being made out of oil and gas because prices are up because of Ukraine. We're no longer those commitments. And banks, the big global banks, are actually pulling back and pulling out of their climate alliances. And so you have somebody like the CEO of Saudi Aramco, the Saudi Arabia oil company, saying, we should abandon the fantasy of phasing out oil and gas and instead invest in them adequately. Not quite our Prime Minister, but, getting there a bit. So up till now, greenhouse gas emissions have been rising. They have not yet peaked, and the reason is that the increasing demand for energy has been greater than the rate at which we deploy renewable energy. And the greatest increase in demand for energy at the moment is crypto, AI, and servers. The quickest way to get emissions down is to reduce demand, but the AI revolution is actually doing the opposite. So the failure to bend that curve down means that we are rapidly heading towards 3 degrees of warming. That's the view of the majority of scientists, and it's the view of the head of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. So I'm going to quickly show you 3 things about that world. Firstly, this is some science on what the world looks like at 2.7 degrees, and these are the areas of the world that climate scientists said would be near unlivable. That is, they would experience conditions currently only felt on 0.8% of the planet, mostly in the Sahara. So at 2.7 degrees, maybe 35 years from now, those parts of the world will be barely livable. So think about it in Asia. I mean, what are we looking at? Pakistan, India, Myanmar, Thailand, Indonesia, Northern Australia. We're living and working outdoors, including agriculture, without air conditioning. Would just not be possible, and there'll be large-scale depopulation. And closer to Chris's heart, this is Northern Australia, and this is where we're under AUKUS, and they're putting a large amount of money to build up bases that in 35 years' time there certainly will be all but unlivable. There certainly won't be any families living there, and there'll probably have to be a FIFO military, fly people in when you need them, put them in an air-conditioned building and fly them out again. So that's our defence strategy. In terms of sea level rises, at 2 degrees of warming, which we'll be at in 15 or 20 years, and this is only cities over 10 million people, the percentage of the population which would be affected by inundation by sea level rise would be Hanoi 30%, Mumbai 39%, Calcutta 24%, Hong Kong 31%, Shanghai 39%, and so on. Which comes to our topic tonight, because human security is all about food and water. And somebody just did some work saying if the AMOC, the Atlantic circulation, were to slow down at 2.5 degrees of warming, what would happen to wheat yields? Now, the purple side is less and the green side is more. And dark purple is reduced to zero, the suitability for growing wheat. So you can see in this map that large parts of Australia, I mean, the area of Australia that is regularly productive for wheat has already dropped by half in the last 30 years. So what are the security implications of this? We know what this looks like. A driver of the Arab Spring was simultaneous crop failures in China, India and Australia produced by climate change. In Russia, it was so bad in 2008-9, the fires were so bad that Putin banned exports for 6 months. There was a drought in China. That tripled the spot price for wheat, and in the area of the world most dependent on wheat imports, which is the Middle East and North Africa, that led to the Arab Spring. It was food riots brought on by simultaneous crop failures that led to the Arab Spring. And of course, that then drove into Syria. In Syria, you had an epochal drought in eastern Syria that displaced 1.5 million people. There were another 1.5 million people from Iraq already there that overwhelmed the cities, drove rents up, caused food shortages, increasing costs, a not happy government, and it led to the Syrian civil war. I'm not saying climate caused the Syrian civil war, but it is one of the principal drivers of the Syrian civil war. That displaced half the population of Syria, half of that externally, many into Europe, which in many ways triggered the migration crisis and Brexit. Without the Syrian civil war, there may not have been Brexit. So this is where climate change has security impacts, and it contributes to the rise of right-wing populism and so on. Chatham House, the UK think tank, says that they think in 2040, 50, 20, 30 years from now, that what we're looking at is a 30% drop in crop yields, but food demand will be 50% higher. 1/3 of cropland will be affected by severe drought, and their conclusion is that cascading impacts will drive, and I quote, drive political instability and great national insecurity and fuel regional and international conflict. So that's sort of the climate security story. So climate change manifests as the breakdown in systems that makes modern human world possible, the food and water systems, the financial system, the orderly relations between governments and people. It's a security issue of human security, of the responsibility of governments to protect the people from this, the greatest threat of all time. So what actions are required? We're at 1.5 degrees now. It's already too hot. We can see that. We see it in LA. We see it in the fires here. So the first lever is zero emissions fast. This is the primary task. It is necessary but not sufficient. There's more to come because the gas industry, the oil industry is expanding. So it is imperative to get carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, what's called carbon drawdown. And we know how to do that. I mean, the most effective way is by restoring and enhancing the natural systems, our forests, our water, our oceans and so on, that can do that. But big tipping points have already been passed and major systems are already destabilising. So the third action are interventions to try and cool the planet. Research is being done, some is being tested, marine cloud brightening on the Great Barrier Reef at the moment to see if they can be efficacious, and doing that work is really necessary. And of course we need to adapt, but if you spend all your money on adaptation and none on mitigation, you won't succeed because it'll simply get too hot. Two very brief points to finish. This climate and security nexus. A certain US president talks a lot about colonising Greenland and Canada. Have you ever thought why? From a climate point of view? Everybody knows that the Arctic will be the area of great strategic competition in the next 30 years. Secondly, there's a lot of strategic minerals in those countries. And thirdly, the titans of Silicon Valley actually believe and think and say that is where they want to base themselves and their families and their technologies when it's too hot everywhere else, apart from buying a lot of land in the South Island and New Zealand. So I mean, when people talk about Canada and Greenland, why has he got these crazy ideas? There is actually a climate component to it. And lastly, because I started talking about fear and hope, I just want to finish with some words from the American writer Octavio Butler. I think Rebecca Solnit quoted these in the book, and I think these words justify me saying what I do. So this is, self-justifying. She says, "The very act of trying to look ahead and to discern possibilities and offer warnings is in itself an act of hope." And just to finish, Chris asked for this interesting slide. Thank you.
Thank you so much, David. I wish I could say that was a pleasure to listen to, but it was certainly enlightening. Chris, would you like to talk us through this slide firstly, or would you like to add anything before we move to that?
Well, I guess I'd just like to tell people how I became involved in looking at climate change. So when I was the Chief of the Defence Force, it wasn't really a serious matter for us in the security world, apart from one or two people who were very advanced. In 2008, at the ANU, I was asked to join an expert advisory panel for the Climate Change Institute by Professor Will Steffen. And I said to him, I couldn't possibly do that unless I've become informed. And becoming informed meant that I read a book called Our Final Hour, written by Martin Rees, Lord Martin Rees now, who was the Astronomer Royal. And in that book, Martin Rees pulls together a range of trends that he could see. And he made the stunning prediction that by 2100, there was a 1 in 2 chance there would be no human beings on the planet. Now, Martin's arguments are very compelling. He's still very much alive and well, aged about 93, I think. He founded at Cambridge University an outfit called the Centre for the Study of Existential Risk. And if you ever have the time, it's worth exploring the work they do. They're looking at a whole range of existential risks, but the two big ones that stand out are, of course, nuclear war and climate change. So in 2018, when our Senate was looking at the problem, I put a paper in and I addressed that issue of existential risk, and I said, on the account of nuclear war, none of us are going to be involved in it. We'll all be victims of it, but it'll be over in a matter of hours, weeks, days and months. On climate change, on the other hand, it's going to have very serious consequences for us all, and but it won't happen overnight, and it won't happen next year. It'll happen over a period of time. but the results look stunningly similar. So this year I'm going to turn the ripe old age of 80. And I wonder how many people will live to be 75 in 2100. And it makes me very concerned about our children and our grandchildren and where we go. So when I was born in 1945, there were 2.5 billion people on the planet after 2 world wars. We're now reaching towards 10 billion people. We're reaching population densities in some countries which are unbelievable when you stop and think about living in a country where there are 3,000 people living in every square kilometre on average. So we have got a very big problem. I spent my military career thinking about risk, thinking about what could really go wrong and make me lose some sleep, and what can I do about it now to stop those outcomes from happening. And it was fascinating because in my term of office we had the security operation in what was then East Timor, now Timor-Leste. We had the Sydney Olympic Games and so on and so forth. And all of those were dealt with by examining the risk. And yet now, when we're talking about climate change and consequences, nobody is doing complex risk analyses except at the Centre for the Study of Existential Risk. They are telling us there is a 6% chance of warming reaching 3 degrees Celsius and a 10% chance of warming reaching 6 degrees of Celsius. So I think we've got a very big problem, but I don't think that's a reason to put our head in the sand and hope it'll go away. I think what we need to do is get active and start working on it. And there are 2 parts to that. The international system, I think, has shown itself incapable of making the adjustments and messages reading. And I'm afraid what's happening in the United States today doesn't fill me with a great deal of hope over the next 4 years. Will Stephen said to me once, in 2030, that is in 5 years' time, we will know the answer, survival or extinction. The problem for us is the 2025 federal election is really our last chance to deal with the big issues on climate change. Because by 2028, which will be the next election, it'll be too late. We won't be able to put a handle on it. In 2010, as part of the Climate Commission, I launched a book with Will Stephen called The Critical Decade. We were talking 2010 to 2020. And we said we were running out of time and we needed to do all these things. We didn't do anything that was needed, and now it's 2025. So I'll end there. That's why I'm interested in it, and that's why I'm doing what I do.
Thank you, Chris. Would you like to talk us through the slide?
Yeah, I had this slide put up because I was involved, also the Australian representative of the Global Military Advisory Council on Climate Change. And at one point we had a team of Bangladeshis who were very interested to know about the future of their country. And they wrote a report which pointed to the issues of the Himalayan glacier, which is a reliable source of fresh water for all the rivers shown on this slide. Now, our region is going to number something like 5.2 billion people. And when I look at this slide, I'm looking at our region, and the Himalayan glacier is going to disappear. And the problem that that produces, of course, is no fresh water for all those countries. No reliable fresh water, that is. They will be able to rely on the monsoon, maybe. They will be able to rely on typhoons sweeping in over China, maybe. But I've been involved doing workshops in Canberra with people from South Asia, and when they look at this problem, they say, so we need to build very large dams to collect monsoon water or typhoon water. What are we going to do with the 5 million people who live on those blocks of land? Where will they go? And in Bangladesh, a country which with 1 metre of sea level rise is going to affect 20% more of the land area than it does already, and it's going to displace 30 million people. And I was in the Parliament House on one occasion, and I was asked, talking about international migration, how many Bangladeshis will come to Australia? Well, I argued that Bangladeshis won't go to India, because India's got something like 1,500 people per square kilometre. And the Indians have built a wall between themselves and Bangladesh, which they patrol actively. And actually, a lot of those countries are a bit like that. Even our near neighbour, Indonesia, is heading for 300 million people. But, you know, the Indonesians are doing something about moving the capital city from Jakarta to Nusantara. And they're building their new capital at the moment because Jakarta's disappearing underwater. So how many Bangladeshis do I think will come to Australia? I said 40 million. Whereupon the politicians in that room all got up and left. Because when you think about it, they won't all come at once, but by golly, it's a hell of a lot of people. And what's the population of Bangladesh? Around 200 million. So it's actually not a large proportion of their population. So these are the kinds of things that we're going to have to grapple with. And it's why I asked for this slide to go up, because you can just see all those rivers are sourced in the Himalayan glacier. And in 2012, I was in London at a climate conference, and they were arguing with each other about the water resources of the Mekong River. And everybody knows, a bit like Murray-Darling, that whoever screws the water is upstairs at source, and what we get left with is what's left over. So river management is a very, very serious problem for our future. The Chinese are building lots of dams already to try and collect most of that melt from the Himalayan glacier.
David, would you like to speak to the impact of on Australia's water supply of climate change that we've seen already?
What we're seeing from the data is that southeastern Australia and southwestern Western Australia are becoming drier. The data is already clear. I mean, there's data showing that the runoff into Perth dams is almost down to zero, because not only is there less rain, it's hotter, more of it evaporates. So there are sort of several reasons for that, which is why the desal plants. As I said, the amount of land in Australia which you can reliably grow wheat on has just about halved. I think there's a definition that you've got to have 5 or 6 good years out of 10 to be counted as reliable, but the amount of reliable land has decreased. I mean, northwestern Victoria would be a really good example of wheatland that's becoming less reliable, and so I mean, when we get climate security, in the end, it's about food and water. I mean, it really is. It's about food and water here. It's about food and water there. I remember being at a conference in 2009 where Mark Howden, who's now at the ANU and was then at CSIRO, put up a graph and said, by 2050, there's a 50% chance that Australia will not produce enough wheat for its own purposes, which was a real shock, because, hey, we were one of the big, wheat exporters. But that's the story. So this is an issue, and how to resolve it? I mean, I think there are two things. I mean, the overwhelming response to this climate security issue is if it gets too hot, there aren't solutions. So the need to double down on the climate agenda is the most important thing. And I was doing a thing last week and people said, what can we do? I said, 10 years ago, how many MPs did you have in Parliament who made climate their number one issue? And they said, 1. I said, how many you got now? 12. I said, this is a transformational change, and it will keep on going. So, I mean, the conversation is changing. Unfortunately, the two large parties won't do it. The second thing is that up to a certain point, there are things we can do in our region to help. We really can. A few years ago, a woman from Sherry Goodman, who was an expert from the US, came out here after the Syrian civil war and said, if we had better modelling and could see that the drought was going to come in Syria, we could have intervened with aid and food supplies to actually stop it happening. And so I think one of the really big things is, yes, there will be extreme events in Asia and they will cause a lot of damage, but it is a food and water issue, and it's not a steady thing. It is moments of crisis. When, for example, rice harvests failed, as they did in India a couple of years ago, and they banned exports for a few months, the greatest rice-producing country in the world. So having the capacity to deal with the periodic food crisis in Asia is the single most important strategic thing we can do. Because if you can stop those food crises, because they're not going to, in the first instance, they're not going to go on forever, they're going to be a few months. If you can stop then you can stop the Syrian civil wars, you can stop those sort of events, and things will be stable. I mean, civil breakdown is a consequence of extreme food insecurity. And so that's the climate and security conversation that we have in Canberra, and there are practical things we can do.
What are they? Dave, Chris? What should we do?
Well, I think the first thing we've got to do is get our bureaucrats, governments and local governments and all of us involved in the process of having the conversations about what needs to happen. We are already seeing what I think becomes a serious tipping point in the insurance business. If you own property now in flood zones that, let's say the Northern Rivers in New South Wales, two floods in 2 years, they become uninsurable. And what happens, of course, is if your property is uninsurable, there's a problem over your mortgage, because theoretically all mortgages are backed by insurance. So we're seeing premiums rise for businesses and for homes exponentially in some cases, and we are already seeing evidence where the insurers will say, we will not insure your property. Now that's not widespread yet, but it'll become more widespread as these things go on. So that's one aspect of our life. The second aspect, and David tilted at this, no amount of adaptation is going to solve the problem without serious mitigation. If you think about the kinds of temperatures that we're talking, are we all going to go and live underground rather than on the surface to survive? How would that look? You can go to Cooperpedia, I suppose, and get a feel for it, but imagine that wide communities are now living underground because of the heat. The issue of heat is a fascinating topic in itself. When I ask the health experts in the HEAL conferences about this, it's not the daytime high temperature that's of serious concern, but it's the overnight temperature. And the experts say when overnight temperatures are 30 degrees Celsius or more, it is a health hazard, a serious health hazard. Now, if you go into the Middle East, you will find a lot of construction work gets done between 10 p.m. and 6 a.m. because they can't handle the heat of the day. So you can make those adaptation moves. But these are very serious problems. And finally, I've been at conferences with farmers for climate action. Nearly every farmer who's a member of that organisation can tell you what is already happening on their land in terms of season, growing capacity, so on and so forth. And that rather cemented a conversation I had when I visited the Barossa Valley a few years ago to find most of those wine growers that were purchasing properties in Tasmania for the future. So there's a lot that we can do. But the fact of the matter is, there's no hope if it's just adaptation. We have got to deal with the mitigation. It is the fossil fuel problem that we've got to deal with. And at the moment, I think the jury's not out. The jury has been retired, I think, because you know what the Trump agenda is for the next 4 years. We are world leaders in fossil fuel exports. So we are all responsible for a future that doesn't look all that palatable.
David, I wanted to ask you about something that you've explained, I think, incredibly well in your publications, which is the concept of the fact that we can't just draw the carbon back down again and reverse the impact of climate change, because we do hit tipping points beyond which there are unremediable consequences. And one of them was you talk about the fact that once permafrost is lost and glaciers have melted, even if we bring the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere down to a certain, back to even if we return to 1.5 degrees, for example, that will not restore those structures. We won't get the glaciers back and the permafrost back. Can you just expound about that, perhaps?
Really good news, isn't it? There's a thing, does it come from engineering, called hysteresis, which says that the path to something is not the same as the path back. It happens in ecosystems and all sorts of things. And I remember talking to an Antarctic scientist, because about 15 years ago there was some work showing that one of the Antarctic glaciers had already hit its tipping point. And we said, when did that happen? He said, look, probably about 0.81 degree. That was the tipping point for Thwaites, which is the most important. But he says, what you have to understand, even if you got back to 0.8, it wouldn't reset. You'd actually have to get back to 0 in order to have the physical condition. So the path up and the path back are not the same thing. So that's the problem. And we are starting to hit those, we're starting to sort of get into that territory now. I mean, in terms of the permafrost and the boreal forest, it's not systemic to the point of being unsolvable. But, I mean, a lot of scientists will say, look, at 1.5, if we get much past 2 degrees, at the rate we're going, that's 15 or 20 years, if we get past 2 degrees, these things are going to be triggered and there won't be a way back. And Will Steffen, the great Australian scientist who unfortunately died, talked about hothouse Earth, where it just keeps on going, we're humans. So, I mean, that's why this is really, really urgent, because it's not like things are linear. Yes, you know, you put up more CO2, it's hotter, there's more water vapour in the atmosphere, it rains more, but in the wrong places. That's all linear, but there are these non-linear processes, and we've really not allowed to get to those points. And that's why when we say this is really urgent, it is really urgent. I mean, the fact that we're giving more gas and coal permits is just like, it's a death wish. Sorry, it is. And thank God we've got some TILs and some people there who are finally calling it out. And we do need to, I mean, a lot of our natural systems have become sources of carbon rather than sinks. I mean, one of the great sources of methane is degraded wetlands. You know, there are things we can do if we had the will and the desire to restore a lot of natural systems. I mean, the soil can hold a lot more carbon than it is now. The forest can hold a lot more carbon than they are now. The ocean can hold more carbon. So the things we can do, but the time frame is really important. And the second thing is slightly different, is, as Monique said in her opening comments, we've never had a conversation about any of these things in the federal parliament. I mean, Chris's group put out a report before the last election asking both parties to do a climate and risk assessment, because it had never been done, to get the intelligence service to assess what I said to you tonight. And the government did, they asked the Office of National Intelligence to do it. They produced a report, I am told unofficially, off the record, I know it has been recorded, it's being live streamed, that it just caused shock and awe. And the ministers, the Security Committee of Cabinet, said that report should never be released. And it was locked down. Then they had a second part, which was to look at the domestic risks, called the National Climate Risk Assessment, which was due to report in December, and it's disappeared too. So in 3 years of a government that was committed to talking about climate risk, we've had 2 reports, one which was done and hidden, and the second one which got put through the shredder. And this is the problem, and that's what I talked about with the health promotion thing. If you can't elaborate the problem in a public discussion like we are tonight, if you can't elaborate the problem, you're never going to talk about what you need to do. Not you.
No, that's fine. Chris, do you want to speak to the defence side of things, because this is where you've come from? Perhaps you could give us your thoughts on that.
Yeah, well, all defence business is a risk business, so that's what we do. We collect information, turn it into intelligence. We then decide to do things to try and head off the worst outcomes that you could imagine, et cetera, et cetera. And so when we put out the Missing in Action report before the 2022 election, we proposed the conduct of the National Climate Security Risk Assessment, and the government picked it up and put it in their platform. The current government picked it up and put it in their platform. And so in the immediate aftermath of 2022, we were pretty buoyant that we would actually get a climate security risk assessment done. The only problem is, I think, as they unpack the issue of external risks to Australian national security, they started to look at those issues of international migrations and displacements and so on and so forth. And I think it scared the pants off people. But we were banging on and saying, but here in the domestic security environment, it's very important that communities are asked about their view of the National Climate Security Risk Assessment. And I've been in a room and heard from people that were affected by bushfires and floods and so on, and it's not a pretty story. You know, those of us that haven't experienced those things have no idea what it's really like. But so these become really very important issues, and I know that every local government authority in the noughties had a climate plan done, because I know the author of all those climate plans. They're all out of date, and I don't think a lot of them have been brought up to date. You may be surprised to know that the Insurance Council of Australia, in a paper they put out 6 months ago, recommended that all property contracts for transfer should include a climate security risk assessment, so that buyers would know what they're about to buy, and so on and so forth. That was the Insurance Council put that forward. They put forward a whole range of other very sensible suggestions about federal, state and local governments should do. I think it's terrific that we're having this town hall meeting here tonight, the first one that I'm aware of in Australia, to have these conversations. I hope we'll do a lot more of them before the next election, because we need to have an honest conversation with each other about where we need to take things. Why it's important, I think it's about people power. I think what we're seeing in the United States is the rich trying to get richer at the expense of everybody else. And I think that's pretty scary, very scary, actually. So from my defence background, I think that we probably need to recraft our defence strategies. If I take President Trump seriously, I think the whole issue of going to war over Taiwan is now dead. I think the Chinese might be encouraged to go and do the job because he's not going to do anything about it. And why would he, when he wants Greenland and Canada and Panama? So I think we've got a lot of problems. And I also think that we need to carefully calibrate what our new defence strategy ought to look like. My own opinion, it's more about looking at ourselves and our vulnerabilities than it is about going off and fighting wars in other people's countries.
I might ask you just one more question, Chris, and then we might go to questions from the audience. This is a Dorothy Dixer. I don't approve of Dorothy Dixers, but I'm going to ask it anyway. Is Australia currently equipped to handle the security threats which are posed by accelerating climate impacts, or would you say that there are gaps in our preparedness and response planning?
Look, every way I looked at it over the last 20 years, we have been ill prepared for nearly every major catastrophe we've experienced. Do you remember COVID-19? Do you remember how well prepared we were for that? Did you know that a country, well, not really a country, but a place called Taiwan with a population similar to ours, was prepared in December 2019, and they swung straight into action because they had had SARS and MERS beforehand. They had 40 million masks available for people to wear. Their economy was never shut down. And they weren't asked to stay at home. And then they made a mistake. So I tracked these figures over 18 months with various countries, and Taiwan was one of them. They made a mistake about 1 year into COVID, and they stopped quarantining aircrew in Taipei Airport over 3 weeks, which is what they had been doing, and they allowed them to quarantine for 5 days. And then COVID-19 jumped out of the wheelbarrow in Taiwan. Up until that time, they had not more than 70 deaths from COVID. An amazing story. You look in the United States, President Trump, I think, was at the helm, and I think there are at least 500,000 Americans who died because of his presidency. And I know there were more deaths, but you can't say all of them were his problem, but I think half of them were his problem. The bushfires. My good friend, John Mullins, went to the government in April and said, we are ill prepared for the fire season that's about to come. And the Morrison government didn't take any notice. And then you might remember when the fires were really running, he was in Hawaii. Remember the green hose story? I think that was stunning. Lack of preparedness and equipping ourselves to deal with these things that are about to happen to us. Pandemics are not going to go away. Bushfires are not going to go away. Floods are not going to go away. But let me tell you a nice story about Australians. Somebody who lives in the Northern Rivers and has been flooded twice in 2 years told the story that the second time, I wasn't even fixed from the first flood, and now I've got the second one. But the heartwarming story was a car pulled up outside. There were a bunch of kids who'd come down from the Gold Coast who just knocked on, 5 of them, knocked on the door and said, we're here to help. What can we do to help? And the person said, it lifted my spirits immeasurably. So here's the message. Community Australia can be made to work. We can do these things. But we need to be better organised. We need to demand being better organised. And we can help each other through these problems.
Thanks, Chris. So Julia and Fiona have microphones. Michael has a question just in the second row here, Fiona.
Thank you. Thank you all for a wonderful presentation. Question to David. Actually, if I might have the temerity just to offer something as well. In your explaining of hysteresis, I find something that really makes it very clear to people is just taking something like a chair, the lectern, that table, and you push it 5-10 degrees and it bounces back to where it was. Keep pushing it and let it go, and there's a point where it doesn't, it just crashes. No amount of letting it go makes it go back to where it was. But to my question, David, you kept quoting scientists and IPCC figures. To my mind, historically, they have been infallibly wrong. They have always been on the shy side of reality. What's your reading of that, and what might the real reality be rather than what the scientists and IPCC are saying?
Oh, I haven't got an hour. Look, science is, in a sense, is a conservative thing because you have to prove something beyond reasonable doubt. It's like a court of law. You know, it's not just I think or maybe I reckon this is what's going on. You've actually got to prove, you've got to have the evidence, it's got to be reproduced by others, it's got to be judged. So science is conservative. You're in a field which is changing very quickly. Climate science is a new science. It hasn't got hundreds of years of history. The knowledge is accumulating quickly, but the physical system is changing very quickly. I guess it's like being a COVID researcher 3 years ago. You're just trying to catch up with reality all the time. So, and the third thing is, climate science started off and didn't know a lot. I mean, they're still discovering things. I mean, we had these incredible hot and cold events in Europe, these incredible storms, this incredible heat, that storm in New York that almost took New York out, because they didn't know that a thing called the Gulf Stream, the jet stream, which separates the Arctic from the rest, rather than going around, was starting to destabilise because of climate. And there's been another thing more recently where there's a new explanation for why we've had this incredible heat in the last couple of years, which is that because we've cleaned up shipping emissions, they have less sulphur in them, and you know what sulphur causes acid rain, so you don't want a lot of sulphur. So brown coal, Latrobe Valley, high in sulphur, very bad, but with less sulphur in the atmosphere, sulphates help to establish low clouds, and low clouds help reduce the amount of... So, I mean, yes, a lot of the science is being conservative, but there are reasons why it's being conservative. I think now there are a lot more scientists who are really outspoken. I mean, I could have spent 15 minutes giving you scientists, not all of them. I mean, it's a bit like the law. There's the black letter lawyers and there's the more interventionist lawyers, if you know what I mean. And there are more people saying what it is. Is the IPCC, the International Panel on Climate Change, conservative? Yes, because it's a body of the UN where the politically appointed ambassadors of 190 countries, including Saudi Arabia and Russia and the United States, choose the lead authors. So, yes, but I think, there's a lot of scientists, who were more forthright than I was tonight. So I think it is still changing, but we know that things are on the high end of the expectations and they will continue to be so.
I just want to add to that. The Centre for the Study of Existential Risk, which I was looking at earlier today, says, why are we always betting on the best case? They say there is a 60% probability that climate change will exceed 3 degrees Celsius of warming, and a 10% probability that it will exceed 6 degrees Celsius of warming. Yet, 60% of the research cited by the IPCC considers warming of 1.5 degrees or less, while only 10% considers 3 degrees Celsius, and no one else is doing any complex risk analyses. Now, as David said, things are improving and we're getting to know a lot more. But it's pretty stunning that now, after nearly 25 years of studying the topic, that call by the Centre for the Study of Existential Risk is as damning as it is.
I'll just editorialise a little bit. I know I've got lots of questions, which is great, but just to point out that those estimated increases in temperatures would not be expected to be uniformly distributed, in that some parts of the world will experience much higher temperature variations than others. And even if you look at cities like Sydney, we see that extreme weather events affect the western parts of Sydney much more than they do those parts closer to the harbour. So there is a certain disparity and injustice in all of this, even with all of us being exposed to higher temperatures.
There is, animal livestock, right? Animal farming is one of the top 3 causes for global warming globally. And out of my little research, I think it's also one of the top 3-4 regions in Australia as well. But we're not talking enough about it, primarily the policymakers, right? David, I've had a quick glance on the report that you published, Breakthrough, brilliant stuff. You've also categorically mentioned there that we are not in global warming anymore, it is global boiling. And the research report also says, that whether it is AIDS, whether it is COVID-19, we knew of the problem, we acknowledged, and we found a solution. So my question is, we all know that there's already a catastrophe coming in our way. Why aren't the policy makers doing enough? What is stopping, is it the capitalists, is it the government? Where is the problem, that we are not able to create a movement around it? Because I don't have a grandchild, but I'm equally worried that my daughters may not have a grandchild. So what do we do, and how do we make sure that everybody acknowledges this issue and creates some solution around it?
I think there's a very simple answer to that conundrum, and that is the cost of action is not free. And if you unpick our economy and start to think about what the consequences of taking serious action are, it's not going to be free. And what I am not seeing is the redrawing of how we run our economies to take account of what needs to be done. It's another reason why we need to have these conversations, because the people who are managing the economy do not want change. They're making money already. They don't need to change. Why should they? And the only way we can affect that change is by demanding and using people power.
The question is, why aren't we prepared for these risks? I did a little bit of writing about COVID and emergency responses, and one of the things I discovered was that in the year before COVID, there was a global survey of the preparedness of nations to deal with the pandemic, and COVID in particular. And in that survey, it was like halfway through 2019, the 2 highest rating countries for preparedness for COVID were the United States and the United Kingdom. And yet they performed the worst. And we can talk about the reasons. It's partly to do with political leadership, but also there was some, and Taiwan wasn't up there. Though the Asian countries were generally better prepared because they'd had SARS and so on, and they knew it. That's why the security leaders have been saying to government, you need to understand the risks. Whatever it is, whether it's avian flu, which is charging us 1 million miles an hour now, I don't know how well prepared we are, I think not too badly, but we need to understand the risk. The simple request that the security leaders have made to the government, and that the independents and Teals and others have taken up, is for the government, this is a really simple thing, for the government to, within the intelligence community, within the Office of National Intelligence, which has already done the work for government and said similar things to what I said to you tonight, to have a special climate threat intelligence unit. It's really simple. Wouldn't cost a whole lot of money. You probably move people to a different office and give them a different name. And mandate that climate intelligence unit provide a public report to the government, to the parliament, once a year. Won't cost a lot of money, probably not a lot. It's a really simple thing. Then at least we could have a public conversation. Why don't we have that? I can only suggest because there are a lot of vested interests who simply do not want a public conversation. I've said this in the public record before. I've had discussion with ministers in Canberra in the last few months and talked about impacts, and verbatim says, David, we don't want to talk about climate impacts. We want to talk about climate as a good news economic story. Quote, unquote. Quote, unquote. We don't want to talk about impacts. We want to talk about this as a good news economic story. And so that I think that there has been a deliberate decision by both major parties not to talk about climate impacts. I did a little bit of work for Chris where I went through everything that several ministers had said in the first 2 years of the Parliament, and just did word counts. You know, like renewable energy batteries, renewable energy superpower, hundreds of times. Antarctica, nil. AMOC, nil. Permafrost, 1. And so, the major parties have decided to have a conversation about climate change, which is never about climate risks. I mean, not only security, but more broadly.
Yes, I'm John Maruri. I was, in the early hours of the morning when I couldn't sleep, I was listening to a program that said that conflicts tend to occur around the freshwater resources. And this, they were talking about Arnhem Land in particular. But I just wondered, one would expect, if that is the case, that there'll be increasing global conflict around the world, if that is the case. The other thing is, CSIRO seem to have known about the risks and threats for the last 70 years. 70 years ago, I had an uncle that was sending helium balloons into the air and telling me, CO2 is rising, greenhouse gas, all caused by fossil fuel burning, etc., etc. And if we don't stop it, we'll be in a huge mess. That was CSIRO. Oh, nothing's happened in the last 70 years to mitigate this. But I just wondered whether that statement about fresh water being the source of, or the lack of fresh water being the source of major conflicts around the world is true.
That's all pretty interesting. The way I see it when we did that look at the Himalayan glacier is, of course, you need good, reliable fresh water to grow food. We know that human beings are more dependent on water, and they can go without food for longer periods. But there is this nexus between the two things. And as I say, I've watched the arguments about rivers. But the other way I look at it, I talked to you about 2.5 billion people on the planet in 1945 and heading towards 10 now. I want you to think about it this way. We are the predatory species. Every human being needs food. Every human being consumes water. Every human being uses energy. Most of us require shelters. I mean, if you go on and you start to think about what are the consequences for the planet's resources of 10 billion people, and we're living in a region of 5.2 or 5.3 billion people, it's enormous, an enormous cost. And the one thing I can say about my good friend Will Steffen, he wrote a lot of stuff, and as David said, he was one of the principal authors of a report called The Hothouse Earth. But Will was good about the possibilities of what might happen. I don't think he was accurate when it comes to timing. And so in those early years when we thought we had lots of time on our hand, what we're finding out now is that time is virtually extinguished and things are happening a lot faster we had anticipated.
Hi, my name is Janine O'Keefe, and I'd like to thank you both, or three of you, for your work so far. I've looked on for many years. The one thing which scares me right now is we've watched the American election and propaganda was significantly at play. We also saw this with The Voice. We've seen it for decades with Merchants of Doubt, if you've watched that film, and I recommend it if you haven't seen it. What do you recommend when it comes to propaganda? Because there's $7 trillion every year goes to the fossil companies. Part of that goes to the Heritage Fund, part of that goes to Atlas, then it goes on to Advance, and then we see it here. What's the plan? Or do you have a plan?
They're easy questions tonight, aren't they? Of course, there are large forces, including the fossil fuel industry, who are engaged in the processes of disinformation. So now is most of Silicon Valley, which is why it should be regulated. But, I mean, there are countervailing forces. This meeting is one of them. I mean, the most important thing is to engage people in this discussion. And the fact is we haven't. I mean, it just sort of amazes me that we have two parties who are really big on defence and security, right? Out-bargaining each other, 360 billion for AUKUS, 400 billion for AUKUS, this sort of thing. Yet security is about, I think Abraham Lincoln said it, George Washington, is about protecting the people. So it's actually not about national security, it's about human security. I mean, the government here is to protect the population, their livelihood, their health, their capacity to live in a civil society and have reasonable relations with each other. That's what security is. So we have this really sort of weird discussion which is about national security, China, but not about human security. So I think one really important thing is to, and it's interesting because in 2018, as Chris says, there was a Senate inquiry into climate and security, which I think Labor and the Greens got up. The Liberal members on that Senate inquiry hated the report's outcome, but they didn't put in a minority report. And the reason is they didn't want any debate. They bit their lip because they didn't want to be dragged into talking about human security. So I think there's a really good thing to be done, and we're doing it tonight, to talk about climate security as human security rather than an abstract national security. And that's why it is so astounding that the major parties won't engage in that discussion. I mean, if you are concerned about people's livelihoods, their health, we know what's coming down the track. It's not quite cost of living, but it's sort of the next thing, really. And we know it. I mean, this story is more prevalent now. As I said, many years ago, in 2010, there was a degree at a conference at Melbourne University called 4 Degrees, and there were 300 people in the world, lots of scientists, policy people, and somebody at the end got up and said, stick up your hand if you think that your children and grandchildren are going to have a better quality of life than you. And there were 3 people in the room who did it. And we see that now in people's attitudes towards having children. I mean, subconsciously we know what's coming up. We see it in all sorts of behaviour, but we don't talk about it. So talking about climate and human security, I think, is a really important way to talk about it. Because if you talk about security, conservative people can't say you're not talking about security, but you are. You're just not doing it in the way they want to.
I'll turn myself off. Look, it's a tough one, but David's right. The concept of security is different in every person's mind. We sometimes feel secure because of the circumstances we're living in. It was interesting, going back to COVID years, my wife and I travelled to Cuba in December of 2019, and before COVID even broke, the Cubans were testing people off the aeroplanes, and they had the test kits set up in the airports, and we all had to go through what I would say now was more like SARS and MERS detections than it was COVID, but they were doing it. We went in through Los Angeles, there was nothing there. Came home here, there was nothing here. So at least in Cuba, they were doing it. I thought that was pretty interesting. And this concept of human security also has, I think, a lot of wrinkles. When I think about, what I do know is that most sensible people in the military do not like war. It worries me that people who make decisions about war are often not military people. But those of us that have been there don't have an appetite to do it again. So that's an interesting set of conundrums. And finally, it always struck me as amazing that it took us so long to get assisted dying legislations throughout our country. And people up until that time were forced to endure horrible pain in the lead up to death in some circumstances. So, yeah, things are changing. David's right. Not changing fast enough. Not going far enough either. But we've got to start somewhere. And as I say, it's people power that's going to make a difference.
Hi, Giselle Wilkinson, and I've got a question for all three of you, which is all about the plan. And it's become pretty evident that we need more than one plan. We need to multi-track on so many different levels. So obviously trying to get our government to listen and then take the appropriate action is one. But we've been actually knocking on that door for quite a long time, not with much success. A little bit of success lately. And Monique, that would be my question to you, would be about what would be your plan, maybe looking from the point of view of the independents and how we as the people in this room can support that plan. Chris, my question to you would be about the plan that was released last year by the Australian Security Leaders Group and what that actually is advocating, if you could outline that briefly for us. And David, my question to you is about what's plan B? Is sort of, if we can't, the people in this room, deal with what's happening in the clouds, if we can't provide the food and water security for all these people that are going to be infected in our own country and beyond, and if we are at a loss of finding the most effective way in this short time that we do have, how do we identify our own role in this work? So maybe firstly Monique and then Chris and David.
I might defer mine and treat it as a question or not, if I may, just because I'd like to come back to that at the very end, if that's okay.
I talk about people power, and I truly believe this is the way we're going to solve the problem. But we've got to mobilise the people. And mobilisation is a very often used military term for going into a state of war. But to be honest, when I look around our country, we are short on people. We're a very large country. And I think the kind of demand for responding to the climate emergency is to mobilise. And I don't mean that in a military sense. I do mean it as people power. I do think we need to mobilise at all levels of government and get the whole thing in sync so that it works for the benefit of all. Now, here's a very interesting fact. Australians have voted with their feet by putting solar panels on their roofs. And we have one of the highest uptakes of solar panels in the world. The other place that mirrors our figures is the state of Texas in the United States. Interesting. But it's not the solution because, our energy demands require a systems approach. I live in Canberra, and with the use of renewables now, somewhere upwards of 85% of Canberra's power now is supplied by renewables through the grid. So it can be done.
I was asked about Plan B. Here's Plan A. Chris has talked about Will Steffen, who is Professor of Climate Science at ANU and advisor to the Gillard-Rudd government. And one of the things he said, he was on the Climate Council, he said, it's really simple. He said, we have to make, it was in a speech somewhere, it was a slide, he said, we have to make climate the first priority of politics and economics. There's a slide. Make it the first priority of politics and economics. Which I guess is what Climate 200 did, and why we have a whole lot of people in Parliament who've said this is the top shelf. There might be a few bottles on the top shelf, but climate's a top shelf issue. The first priority of climate and economics. I think that's a really simple way of putting it, and the test for anybody who's standing for Parliament to be voting for them or not, or thinking about it, is are they making climate the first priority of economics and politics, because that is what it's going to take. So that's Plan A. And the polls show we'll likely have a hung parliament, and so there'll be two large parties looking for support from a whole lot of independents, and obviously there's a price those independents will demand to support one side or the other. And I personally think that those demands should be around making climate the first priority of politics and economics. There's an opportunity here in a few months to really, torture one of the big political parties and screw things up a bit. So I think that's Plan A. Plan B, I think, is to recognise that our political system may be so maladapted to the requirements of the society that it will go extinct. I mean, I don't say this. I mean, there are many ways that the United States and here, our political systems are just not adapted to dealing. And there's a question about why don't we see the risks? They're just not maladapted to understanding long-term risks and dealing with them. It's 3 years and so on. But I would say Plan B is what I learned when I was a kid up on the north coast of New South Wales 70 odd years ago. In little country towns we had bushfires and floods, and the bell would ring in the school and they'd say the flood's coming, and the buses would come, they'd take everybody home, and the baker would make extra bread because once the river was crossed there'd be no bread on the other side for 2 days, and the milk would be restored, and they'd get out the tractors and so on. I mean, there was a sense of preparedness because an emergency is coming. And it was well practiced. Fires, floods, all the same thing. Every year there was this mode the society went into where the council did different things, the coppers did different things, the baker did different things, the school closed down, the road was closed, and you said, we are now in a different mode. This is not normal mode. This is, immediate problem mode. And, I mean, many years you wrote a book about this. That's the mode we need for climate. There is no normal anymore. And to accept climate as a normal problem with a normal solution is part of the maladaptation.
I know I haven't finished my bit, but I'll come back to it. I think this might need to be our last question. Thank you.
Chris, I'm just concerned about the implications of all these refugees who will inevitably coming down from Asia. At the moment we turn back the boats, but how will Australia cope with the pressure of all those people coming towards us?
Yeah, it is a good question, and to come back to my story about the 40 million from Bangladesh, the real fact of the matter is we'll be overwhelmed. I feel that if you looked into our Indigenous communities, they've been overwhelmed by us. We might be overwhelmed by people coming from Asia. But the systems aren't good enough at the moment to keep them where they live when things are failing. And that breakdown, I mean, I think the 21st century is a century of failed states and poor leadership. And we are seeing that played out under the pressures that we're now living through. So I think it's very tricky. But it's not a reason to give up trying to do things. You know, we have to try, and we have to try and make it work on our terms. Though we have to be sensible about it. And that's what worries me, is that we're not often sensible about some of these things, and we can be found out. The numbers are astonishing. I mean, even in Indonesia, 300 million people and an economy 6 times that of Australia's is going to be a different future for us. But they're at least building their new capital because their existing one's sinking beneath the water. It's going to screw Borneo, but that's another question. And finally, I want to talk just quickly about unintended consequences. You'll recall the Canadian bushfire problem. It was created by Canadians planting trees in order to soak up carbon. And what they created was a huge fire because all those trees were the same kind of trees and they all burned with the same intensity. Bushfire experts will tell you that native forest is the best protection against firestorms. And I got told that after I'd driven down the King's Highway out of Canberra to the south coast, and I saw blackened trees and I saw trees that didn't look marked at all. And I said, you know, we were reading horrible stories about what was going on, but what happens here? And the answer is those old trees are fire resistant more than young trees.
So I think in many ways this discussion this evening has been quite confronting. I'm sure everyone probably feels the same as me, that, you know, the statistics and some of these facts, if we believe them, and I think the people here are people who believe science and evidence and believe that what we've heard this evening is true. I wouldn't be sitting here in front of you now if I didn't believe it too. I do know, though, that, and it is a bit terrifying, and sometimes this sort of information can feel a bit overwhelming. I do know, though, that I think if we talk about tipping points, I think we are at a bit of a tipping point, in Australia at least. And what each of us can do is to try to influence those people within our own sphere of influence, and to try and take action on those things that we believe are important. In 2022, as David has alluded to, a whole lot of us were elected to Parliament because we believe in climate change and we believe that our government was not doing enough to combat it. We had some hope that the incoming Labor government would do what they say, and that the climate wars would be over, as the incoming Prime Minister told us that they would be on the 21st of May 2022. In Australia, at least, they are not over, we know that. And we've seen, as David alluded, in the last 3 years, we've seen 3 new coal mines approved and more than 110 new fossil fuel projects being approved by the Albanese government. We've also seen the government set up infrastructure, or the legislation to permit infrastructure for carbon capture and storage under the seabeds, and is actively engaging in development of carbon capture and storage under seabeds as a potential new export industry for Australia. That we will take carbon dioxide from countries overseas and put it under our seabeds, or put it under the ground here as a new industry for us, which is something of kind of Orwellian dimensions in many ways. I think that we've reached a tipping point politically, and I think that after the 2025 federal election, things will change only if we have a crossbench which holds the major parties to account on climate, which is one of the things I'll be hoping to do if I can be elected in 2025, re-elected in 2025. In every seat around, we talk about democracy and what what is possible. There are 150 seats in the House of Representatives in this country, and there are independents sitting in many of those seats who have a commitment to action on climate change, and who, if they are elected, will take action on it and will hold the major parties to account. We know that we won't get that action unless we have a crossbench that can do that. So what I would ask all of you and anyone who's watching this on the live stream is to think about that and think, if you do care about these things, if you believe in them, and you do care about your kids and your grandkids, not to be alarmist and not to try and scare people, but to know that you can only change what you can change yourself, and you can do that in your own way. But if you're in a position to put up a core flute, if you're in a position to talk to your neighbours and to talk to the people you work with, and to talk to them in a way which is science-based and evidence-based and rational, but has the urgency that I think we all will take away from this evening's meeting, please do that. And please do what you can to get a crossbench elected in the Parliament in 2025, which will take action on those things, and will also take action on disinformation and lies in our media and online. We know that it's a massive problem. There's a piece of legislation ready to go about truth in political advertising that neither of the major parties in this country would let us debate a couple of weeks ago. There are things that we can do. But it does start with conversations. It starts with conversations when we knock on people's doors. It starts with the conversations you have at work or with your family members. And I guess I would finish by asking all of you, just if you do believe this, and I think you probably all do, to do what you can to help. It'll make you feel better. If you take action and you get out there and you change some minds and you make a difference, you can do it. And I honestly believe that the best conversations are those when we respectfully discuss matters of great importance with our friends and our colleagues and our relatives, and we can change a mind. So that's how I'm going to finish tonight. I'm going to finish by thanking Admiral Chris Barrie for his wisdom and his knowledge and his generosity with it, and David Spratt for the same, for their expertise and their knowledge and their generosity. And I know it's not easy to talk about these things when they're difficult subjects and they're distressing in many, many ways. But we can only take action if we understand the scope of the problem, the size of the problem, and how we can affect change on it. And so I thank you both for coming this evening.